Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz here in our Northwest Side studio. Brandis Friedman has the evening off.
And I'm Amanda Vinicky reporting live from Chicago's West Ridge neighborhood.
On the show tonight, what is the future of public transit in Chicago? We find out from the heads of CTA, Metra, PACE, and the RTA.
More cars equals more accidents that involve cars. I mean, that just makes sense.
3 pedestrians killed by drivers in Chicago last week. How to make the roadways safer.
Once we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we should keep marching.
Today marks the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. We look at where the fight for ballot access goes now. The big history behind these little homes in tonight's Ask Jeffrey.
I'm Angel Ito, and I'll have a recap on this year's virtual Duck Derby.
And Paris, as I mentioned, I'll be co-anchoring tonight from Chicago's West Ridge neighborhood as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. It's one of Chicago's many diverse communities, home to Middle Eastern and South Asian residents and businesses. We'll be talking about how they're trying to rebound from the pandemic. But first, Paris, back to you for some of the top stories from today.
Of course, Devon is such an important commercial strip in Chicago. Thank you, Amanda. Hundreds of faculty and staff at the city colleges of Chicago are threatening labor action if they are forced to return to campus. They say not enough is being done to ensure their safety. At a virtual news conference, Cook County College Teachers Union President Tony Johnston said a no-strike clause in their contract would not stop them from taking action to protect their members.
So while a strike itself would be illegal, if our members decide that it's necessary, we will do so.
Johnston says a survey of members last week found 85% were willing to strike and that only 5% say they felt safe returning to classrooms. And speaking of college, Loyola University Chicago announces that students will not be able to live on campus. School is closing all its dorms for the fall due to COVID-19 health concerns. Now, the school had planned on having students living in single dorms and others living nearby at Hampton Inn, but now there'll be a select few in-person classes and the vast majority will be virtual. No word on when dorms might open up again. Illinois extends jobless benefits for 20 weeks. This due to the coronavirus pandemic that has led to a high unemployment rate. The Illinois Department of Employment Security says in a statement that, quote, 20 weeks of state extended benefits are now available to those who exhaust the allotted 26 weeks of regular state unemployment and the additional 13 weeks of federal pandemic emergency unemployment compensation benefits. Illinois law does provide for 20 weeks of extended benefits during times of, quote, high unemployment. And public health officials report that more than 1,900 new coronavirus cases were confirmed in Illinois in the past 24 hours. That's the highest number recorded since late May. Another 21 people have died, and the state has now recorded almost 7,600 COVID-19 deaths, and more than 188,000 cases since the pandemic began. West Ridge is a neighborhood on Chicago's far north side. We visited that area in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic. It is one of the most diverse communities in the city of Chicago, and now we are back to see how businesses along the neighborhood's famed commercial corridor, Devon Avenue, and elsewhere are faring. Our Amanda Vinicky joins us now from West Ridge with the latest edition of our series, Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood. Amanda.
Paris, yes, early on in the pandemic, West Ridge was a coronavirus hotspot. For a time, the zip code that comprises much of the area was actually home to the highest number of COVID-19 cases in Chicago. It's hard to say why that changed, but it did. It's not anymore. The positivity rate for coronavirus here, 3.8%, a full percentage point less than the city average. Now, throughout all of that time, the Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition has been trying to help vulnerable populations, including by working with other organizations trying to serve as a bridge to groups with similar missions. The coalition's director, that is, Rima Kamran, says that many of the people who live and who work in West Ridge are foreign-born. There are many refugees living here. She says really it is a mix: Jews, Arabs, South Asians, East Asians, Africans, and Latinos.
Just look around you. If you are on Devon, you see everything from wedding shops to markets. You see a variety of different languages. It's not a monolith here. We have different ethnicities, different cultures, as well as different faiths that all live and work and are a part of Westridge as a whole.
Lately, her coalition has been trying to reach everyone to make sure that every single individual who lives in Westridge participates in the census. They are trying some innovative outreach tools, passing out portable prayer mats. Now, these are particularly useful these days because due to COVID, many mosques are requiring worshipers to bring their own prayer mat. So you can bring these. They even have a compass so that worshipers can use this mat anywhere and easily be able to find the direction of Mecca. Another giveaway.
We have the accessory of 2020, which is the mask. Just giveaways to let people know it's important to have your voice be heard.
The Devon Bank on Western Avenue has served the Westridge community for 75 years, and Irv Lowndy has worked at the bank for 60 of them. He is also president of the Westridge Chamber of Commerce, and he says the area used to be a Jewish enclave, and then it evolved into an international marketplace.
Devon Avenue became the largest Indo-Pac shopping center in the United States based on the concentration of stores. And we still like to market it as the international marketplace.
Now, in an effort to do that marketing of it as an international marketplace, the Westridge Chamber of Commerce is planning a samosa eating contest in October, so get hungry. Lowndy says many businesses along Devon Avenue are having a harder time now than they did during the Great Recession. Now, one longtime business on the strip is Uma Sari's. It was established in 1973. That's almost as long as Uma and Aurora have been married. They've been together
50 years?
50 years.
Yes. Touch wood. No, yours. My head.
Now, the Auroras say that it has been hard for them. Before COVID, they say Devon Avenue was thriving, full with people passing by who would stop in. They would buy clothes or jewelry. But now they say people are scared. They're staying home, not buying clothes or saris. And they're lucky to get a handful of sales.
Everybody is suffering. It's worldwide, so we're not the only ones. So, but God is watching.
Now, nearby in Lincolnwood, the Lebanese restaurant and bakery features Lebanese and French cuisine and treats. The owner and GM says that due to COVID, he's put a hold on an expansion that was ready to go. It would be happening really as we speak. And now also all staff there have their temperatures checked twice a shift. But he too is not complaining, especially considering the recent explosion in Beirut where he grew up.
I still have a big family in Lebanon living, especially in Beirut. They were living outside their home. There is no homes anymore. Their homes are destroyed.
He says it's like a Hiroshima for Lebanon, and he says recovery is going to be all the more difficult, and not just because of the pandemic. He also says it's because of corruption in government reaching up to the highest levels, such that it is going to be particularly difficult to get relief to the people who truly need it. He has been living in the United States for some 24 years now, and he says even with all of the hardship that people are experiencing, he's grateful.
That's what people don't know about the United States, the rights that you have here. In my country, or that part of the world, you have no rights. If people would look what's happening in the world, they should be very grateful for this country. It's a country that gives opportunities.
Now, later on, Paris, we will be back more to talk about the impact of COVID in the Westridge area. Also talk a little bit of state politics with the area's state senator. But for now, back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. If you've ridden CTA or Metro in the last few months, it may feel like you're riding a ghost train. Ridership has improved a bit since the pandemic hit, but it's nowhere near pre-COVID levels. Mass transit has gotten a boost from the federal CARES Act, but lawmakers in Washington are meeting over a second stimulus effort right now to provide relief to Americans, including the nation's mass transit agencies. U.S. Representative Jesus Chuy Garcia of Illinois wants a stimulus package of at least $32 billion this time around.
Very important to note that the $25 billion that came from the CARES Act was never intended to carry those transit agencies through the rest of the year. $32 billion is needed today. It's needed because public transit is not an option. It is a lifeline for so many people who depend on it day in, day out across the Chicagoland region.
And now let's hear what the leaders of the 4 regional transit agencies think. They are Regional Transportation Authority Executive Director Leanne Redden, PACE Executive Director Rocky Donahue, Chicago Transportation Authority President Dorval Carter Jr., and Metra CEO and Executive Director Jim Derwinski. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, I'll start with you, Dorval Carter Jr. We know that COVID has drastically impacted budgets. The question on everyone's mind all the time, does that mean service cuts or fare hikes for CTA?
Well, I think the good news is, as you indicated in the opening here, the CARES Act funding has really helped stabilize our financial situation in the short term. CTA got about $817 million out of the allocation to this region, and that has allowed us to make sure that we're good for the rest of the year. But next year will be a different picture if we don't get additional funding and get additional relief from Congress.
So you're good for the next 6 months. How about you, Jim Derwinski with Metra?
And Metro received $480 million of CARES Act money. We're going to be good for the rest of this year. We were able to actually reduce service levels. Our service went down to about 2.3% at its low of pre-COVID levels. We're running about 55% of our pre-COVID trains, and that's helped us actually extend that CARES money a little bit more into 21.
And same thing with PACE. You've had to sort of reduce some service to extend that money. Am I correct?
That's right, Paris. We've actually had to reduce service on about 100 of our routes, which is almost 50% of our service. But similar to Dorval and Jim, we've received a little over $100 million of CARES money and should be good through 2020. But 21 is a completely different story as it relates to what the budget may look like.
A different story. Let's take a look at some ridership numbers. It's down more than 70% right now across all the agencies. Farebox revenue down anywhere between 90 and 95%. Sales tax revenue down 30%. Budget tsunami here. Leanne Redden, how long can this be sustained if ridership doesn't improve?
Well, as the other 3 leaders just indicated, we can get through 2020 largely due to the CARES Act money. I mean, this is a broader issue, and it ties more directly to when the economy comes back and when people are back at work and people are back at school. You know, we are very much hopeful for this next round of some relief money from the federal government. I penned a letter just last week asking for that support.
How much do you need specifically for all the transit agencies?
Well, at this point, it's really hard to estimate exactly. We're estimating for 2020 we'll be short about $900 million. None of us have a crystal ball. It's really difficult to predict, but I can tell you that those numbers are pretty alarming. The CARES Act is filling the hole in the short term. But as we look to 2021, they're going to be really difficult decisions to be made. But it's also complicated by the fact that we don't have that crystal ball. We don't know how quickly the economy is going to turn around. So we really need to be kind of being fiscally responsible, which these guys are doing very well at, and continue to.
So Dorval Carter, you made a point to say that most of the service has been in place, especially like that night owl service for people that work late night jobs. Will that have to be on the chopping block if you don't get more money from the federal government?
Well, I think like Leanne said, I don't know what will be on the chopping block at this point in time, but I do know this, that absent any additional funding from some other source, I only have 2 levers that I can use to address any budget deficit that I have to face. That's either increase fares or reduce service. And so as everyone here is saying, it's critical for us that we get additional funding to help us get through this, because the last thing that this economy needs right now is a reduction in public transit service.
And Jim Derwinski, you know, there's studies that show that even once the worst of the pandemic is passed, for years and years and years, there might be permanent changes in people's employment habits. As many as a third of workers will choose not to commute anymore. What does that mean for the long-term outlook of Metra?
Well, it's very evident. You know, we saw the fastest collapse and the deepest collapse of our normal ridership, and that's based on the fact that our riders were able to basically transition their work to home. We've seen a very slow, steady increase, only about 10% now. But I'm a firm believer that everything's going to change and everything's going to adapt. People will eventually get back, and you know, face-to-face meetings are going to be part of business. It's the way business was, the way business will be. We can only do so many on Zoom meetings, and eventually ridership will change. It might be a totally different ridership than we saw in the past, but ridership will be here. Transit will be here for those riders.
So you're optimistic that that ridership will come back. Let's hear from a transit advocate about some concerns they have about serving Black and brown communities.
I'm curious what they are doing to be responsive to those most in need, those riders who have no other choice besides transit, and who continue to be the backbone of the system and of the riders. What are they doing to be responsive to the needs of the Black and brown bus riders on the west and south sides?
Leanne Redden, I'll give this question to you. I mean, as a whole system, how do you respond to that, to the needs of Black and brown citizens and some of the most vulnerable residents?
Well, I think that's foremost of on our minds, and the three operating agencies have shown that transit can rise to, you know, to that challenge through the pandemic, and their own staff as essential workers were providing full service across the region to provide essential workers access to jobs. Equity is a huge access, mobility and equity are huge underpinnings of everything we're sort of thinking about and planning about both now and in the future. So, you know, the services are critical. We talk about it in terms of the economy, but it's really an underpinning of our whole region's society. And that is foremost, I think, on everybody's minds as we're sort of looking to work our way through the actual immediate crisis of the pandemic, but into the future as well.
All right, we're going to leave it right there for now. We'll be back with our guests later in the program to discuss how they're keeping passengers safe from COVID-19. But for now, my thanks to Leanne Redden, Rocky Donahue, Dorval Carter Jr., and Jim Derwinski. And staying on the transportation beat, last week, 3 pedestrians were killed by drivers in Chicago. 49-year-old Radame Morales and 41-year-old Luis Galdos in Humboldt Park, and 28-year-old Siobhan Trimble on the near west side. As Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg reports, the pandemic may have exacerbated dangerous road conditions.
So far this year, 21 pedestrians have been killed by drivers, according to city data and media reports. That puts Chicago on pace to match last year's 40 pedestrian deaths. The stay-at-home order in the spring dramatically reduced traffic volumes, but as we've reported, sharply increased dangerous driving.
The fewer cars on the road, the faster and faster the cars went.
That meant more speeding violations and serious crashes, says Josh Ellis of the Metropolitan Planning Council. At the same time, many people are walking and biking more for their physical and mental health, and because those who can are avoiding public transit. And in the last few weeks, Ellis says car traffic has been on the rise.
It's been at about 90% of pre-COVID levels. So there's a lot of cars. They seem to still be going faster, but you also have more cyclists and more pedestrians. And so crashes and fatalities seem somewhat inevitable.
Ellis says that's because Chicago needs to do more to slow down drivers, things like lower speed limits and infrastructure, speed bumps and bump outs that slow down turns. But even more so,
trying to reduce the number of cars, to me, seems the most important thing. Trying to slow the cars down is number 2.
Reducing the number of cars means people feeling comfortable with public transit, good walking and biking infrastructure across the city, and creating a culture that respects every kind of way that people get around. And Ellis cautions we can't just rely on enforcing traffic laws to keep people safe, because that can mean racial disparities.
I don't feel like that's been enough of the conversation. It certainly has been in some neighborhoods, but not for enough of us, right? We still see disproportionate ticketing in some neighborhoods, disproportionate enforcement of bike infractions in neighborhoods that have very little biking, mostly on the south and west sides. Like there's something in here and we need to interrogate that.
And as the pandemic continues into colder weather, Ellis thinks we might see even more people who have a car choosing to drive. So,
slow the cars down, get people out of the cars, and make it really safe on a broad definition of safety everywhere in the city for everyone to get where they need to go, how they need to go.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg.
As part of its Vision Zero plan, the city of Chicago says it's committed to ending deaths and serious injuries from traffic crashes by 2026. The Chicago Department of Transportation has not yet responded to a request for comment on this story. And we're back with a look back at the Voting Rights Act as it celebrates 55 years.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight Podcast and subscribe.
55 years ago today, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. This year's anniversary falls just weeks after the death of Congressman John Lewis, who fought for voting rights as a key part of the civil rights movement. But many groups say voting rights, especially for Black and Hispanic citizens, are eroding and the law badly needs to be updated. This as fears of COVID-19 and rhetoric around mail-in voting also threaten ballot access. Joining us to talk about the Voting Rights Act and voting issues that are still with us are Colleen Connell, the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois, and Stevie Valles, the Executive Director of the group Chicago Votes. Welcome both of you to Chicago Tonight.
Hello.
Thank you.
First, Colleen, remind us what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 accomplished.
Well, the Voting Rights Act is perhaps the most important civil rights act in the history of the United States. From the time of its implementation through 2013, the Voting Rights Act really resulted in the increased participation of millions of Americans, particularly African Americans and Latino Americans, in voting, and obviously the fundamental building block of our democracy.
Democrats in Congress have pushed for several years to restore certain aspects of the Voting Rights Act. In fact, former President Barack Obama brought this up when he eulogized John Lewis last week. Let's take a look.
Once we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we should keep marching to make it even better by making sure every American is automatically registered to vote, including former inmates who've earned their second chance. By adding polling places and expanding early voting and making Election Day a national holiday.
Stevie Valles, you heard what President Obama said about it. What do you think needs to be made better about the Voting Rights Act?
I agree with everything, for the most part, that the president just said. I think we also need to go a step further and start to really have dialogue around making sure people who are in prison and serving felony convictions are not having their right to vote stripped away as part of being detained. I think there is a rich and long history on, the reforms that need to be made to the justice system as it pertains to Black and brown people. And the number one disenfranchising thing for Black and brown people in America is being incarcerated in prison, or, like the president said, not knowing that their rights have been restored or restricting their rights from being restored when released from prison.
So a lot of issues to deal with. Colleen Connell, there was a Supreme Court decision in 2013 that many say gutted the Voting Rights Act. What specifically did it gut?
So the decision you're referencing is the Shelby County decision. And what it gutted was the provision of the Voting Rights Act that required basically the southern states, the states of the former Confederacy, to pre-clear any changes in their voting laws with either the U.S. Department of Justice or a special three-judge federal court. And the purpose for that was because those states had obviously, in the years since the Civil War and the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which said that the right to vote shall not be abridged on the basis of race or former condition of basically being enslaved, southern states had basically passed many repressive measures, including poll taxes and literacy tests and really difficult registration requirements to disenfranchise millions of African Americans.
It has led to things like the elimination of polling sites many times in urban areas. Stevie Valles, according to census data, 71% of white Americans are registered to vote, 64% of black, 55% of Hispanic. Why this disparity among different demographics?
I think access to civic knowledge is a huge disparity around people having the energy it takes to go and register to vote. I think in Black and brown communities, there are a number of pressing issues, including access to healthcare, access to fresh produce, access to well-funded schools, and just putting food on your table on a day in and day out basis. So while voting may be on the front of people's minds who tend to have a little bit more privilege, there are other things on the front of people's minds before voting. And I think that could be one of the contributing factors amongst many.
Of course, another contributing factor right now is the COVID-19 pandemic. Colleen, how is that impacting efforts to register more voters?
I think that the limitations on early voting, the voter ID requirement, and the restrictions on registration that we have seen southern states in particular pass after the Shelby County decision have made it much more difficult to vote. And many of those states show no sign of loosening those barriers to voting because of the COVID virus. In fact, we see just the opposite with the Republicans in Congress refusing thus far to appropriate more money to make vote by mail possible.
In the few seconds we have left, Stevie Valles, how is Illinois and Chicago doing compared to other states or the national average when it comes to voter registration by demographic and ballot access?
I think Illinois is competitive with other states around the country. The demographic breakdown amongst communities who are registered to vote versus not registered to vote and turning out versus not is similar here as it is in other communities. And every election has a different story. It depends on the political climate. It depends on who's on the ballot. And this year will be one like no other. So we'll see how it all shakes up.
We certainly will. All right, Colleen Connell and Stevie Valles, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we go back to Amanda Vinicky, who's co-anchoring tonight's show in the city's West Ridge community as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. Amanda.
Yes, we're actually joined now by State Senator Ram Vilivalam. His district represents much of the West Ridge neighborhood. He is a Democrat, by the way. Senator, thanks so much for joining us on Chicago Tonight. We are 5 months into this pandemic. What are you hearing from residents about what they need the most?
Well, first and foremost, I'm hearing that people still need help. People are facing unemployment. They're facing challenges with their business. They're facing challenges with being able to pay rent and mortgage, food assistance. It runs the gambit. And the honest truth is, we did a decent amount of work in Springfield. We need to do more. We also need help from the federal government. The federal government needs to step up and extend the unemployment insurance benefits again. They need to provide funding for state and local governments as well, among other items.
What specifically can the state do? Can't do much about the feds.
Well, the state, first and foremost, can continue to advocate at the federal government, support our members of Congress, put pressure on the White House and the U.S. Senate to make sure that they do another package. Secondly, and I signed a letter to that effect, secondly, the state needs to reevaluate. We have passed rental assistance, mortgage assistance, food assistance, and so forth. We need to reevaluate where these programs are, and we need to go back when the time is appropriate to add additional funding to make sure that we are best serving our constituents.
When might the appropriate time be?
I think the appropriate time is, we're still looking at November as a possible time for veto session or another special legislative session. That is a time where I think we'll be in a position to understand what's worked and what hasn't worked and what we need to do.
Now, West Ridge was for a time one of the places that had more COVID-19 cases than anywhere else in Chicago. That has gone on the downside. Why was it a hotspot in the first place, and what changed that?
That's a really good question. As you know, the West Ridge is, I think, the most culturally diverse neighborhood in the entire state. I am so proud to represent this community. I think what happened was what was happening in a lot of places, which is we didn't have the information that we have now. We were able to, as a community, come together, hold meetings virtually, discuss what's happening, talk to our religious leaders, our community leaders, come up with a plan to say, hey, we need to make sure we're getting the word out about this public health crisis. And that's what we did. And that's why you see, as you mentioned, the 60645 zip code was the top in the state for positive cases for a week or two, and now we're among the lowest. And so it really is the resilient communities, and keep in mind, communities that come from places that have genocides. People have experienced tragedy, so they got it and they responded, and I'm so proud of them.
They responded, and perhaps knowing and having gone through that, willing to stick with it, while some people seem to have perhaps given up some.
Absolutely.
And speaking of, the state today reported nearly 2,000 cases, the highest since the end of May. Is it time for some of those areas to scale back on what they had been doing in terms of reopening?
Well, first and foremost, we need to follow the science. We need to follow the public health guidelines. I put my trust in Dr. Ngozi Ezike and Governor Pritzker. They have led us to the point where Illinois, the state of Illinois, is leading the country in our response in terms of from a public health standpoint. So I'm going to follow and work with them to follow the science in public health. I will say this, everybody needs to wear a mask. Everybody needs to socially distance. Everybody needs to wash their hands for 20 seconds. If we do those things, we will continue to be on the right path. If we don't know where we're going to end up.
Now, you are a Democratic state senator, so you're not a member of the Illinois House, but regardless, as a Democrat, Michael Madigan is the chair, the head of your party in Illinois. Given the ComEd scandal, is it time for him to resign from that post, and why or why not?
It's a fair question. I think first and foremost, I strongly believe in term limits for party leaders. We need to make sure that there is a turnover in terms of our leadership, just period, generally speaking. Secondly, we need to regain the public trust of our state, the people in our state. That is not necessarily going to happen with one leader being removed. It's going to happen when there's a series of real ethics reforms, not something to just get a headline, something that's going to substantively change the way we do business in the Capitol. That's what I'm focused on. That's what my colleagues and I have been focused on for the past several months.
So not weighing in directly then on the Madigan question. Thank you so very much. That again is State Senator Ram Vilivalam. And Paris, back to you. We'll be back with more later.
All right, Amanda, you tried to pin him down there. Thank you so much. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, 4 heads of transit agencies on how they're keeping riders safe during COVID-19. Coach houses from plain to fancy. Jeffrey Bayer gives us a tour in tonight's edition of Ask Jeffrey.
It gives people pause to see something, reflect.
And how a public duck display is helping Special Olympics Illinois celebrate 15 years. But first, some of today's top stories. Public health officials report just under 2,000 new coronavirus cases, making it the highest number recorded since late May. That brings the statewide total to more than 188,000, plus an additional 21 people have died. The state has now recorded nearly 7,600 COVID-related deaths. A Southside neighborhood gets a $10 million grant to help transform a vacant building and a vacant lot into a community health hub. The Pritzker-Traubert Foundation announces its first ever Chicago Prize going to the Auburn Gresham neighborhood, more specifically to Always Growing Auburn Gresham. That's a nearly $53 million project being developed by a collaboration of local groups like the Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation. Foundation trustee Brian Traubert and former U.S. Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker announced the prize.
We're excited about Always Growing Auburn Gresham. It takes a 1920s terracotta building that's been empty for decades and converts it into a much-needed health hub.
You can check out our website for more on that grant and the recipient's reaction to being selected. Faculty and staff at the city colleges of Chicago are threatening labor action if they're forced to return to in-person classes. They say not enough is being done to ensure their safety. At a board meeting this afternoon, City Colleges Chancellor Juan Salgado stressed that most classes would be virtual and that the administration was following public health guidelines to protect staff and students.
Face-to-face instruction will be undertaken only as public health
conditions allow and with social distancing in place. We are constantly monitoring the situation on the ground, and should the situation warrant revision to our plans, we will do so in consultation with public health officials.
Meanwhile, an administrative assistant at Olive Harvey College says she is a breast cancer survivor and she is scared for her life if she is forced to return to work on campus.
I can't risk getting sick, because if I get sick, I just don't think that I'm going to make it. I love my job. I love what I do. And I just want to go to work and feel safe.
On Tuesday, a security officer at Olive Harvey on the south side tested positive for COVID-19. Earlier in the program, the heads of the area's local transit agencies shared their thoughts on the financial impact of COVID-19 on public transit. And joining us once again with more are Leanne Redden, Rocky Donahue, Dorval Carter Jr., and Jim Derwinski. Okay, welcome back. Rocky, I want to go right to you. Let's talk about safety. How do you ensure that passengers, when they get on the PACE bus, they are safe from exposure to COVID-19?
Well, we're cleaning like we've never cleaned before. We're sanitizing vehicles daily. We're cleaning high-touch surface areas throughout the day. We provided our operators with PPE to the tune of $20,000 a day we're spending on masks and gloves and hand sanitizers. We put up temporary barriers. We've put out more equipment and more drivers on routes that have high areas. But our passengers need to do their part too, and we encourage them, they need to mask up. They need to wear our masks.
Yeah, and you talked about wearing a mask at Dorval Carter Jr. I'll just share a personal anecdote. I was on a CTA bus. There was a passenger talking on the phone that did not have a mask. In that instance, who's in charge of enforcing those requirements?
Well, as you can imagine, when you're carrying more than 250,000 people a day, over 2,000 or more or plus vehicles, it is very hard for CTA to enforce what our customers do or don't do. We're basically focused on an education campaign. If you've been on our system, you'll see signage everywhere reminding customers that they need to wear a mask, reminding them that it's a requirement to wear the mask. And we're going to continue to reinforce that everywhere we can, recognizing that enforcement, just like it is for any other part of the city, is always going to be a challenge.
Leanne Redden, also important is the safety of drivers and conductors that work throughout the systems. What are you hearing from them? How do you ensure their safety?
Well, I think that's a question best posed to the operators, but I can tell you that the three, CTA, Metro, and PACE have really created an environment of COVID prevention and cleaner, safer, providing the equipment to their drivers and their operators. And a lot of this is education, but riders have to do their bit too. They have to be wearing masks. They have to be practicing social distancing and washing their hands. We're all in this together, and that's been said a lot, but that is a really important point that, we can do so much and the riders have to do their bit as well.
How about on Metro, Jim Derwinski? How are those protections being enforced?
Just like on the other, like Dorval Carter, extensive signage, extensive announcements at the station, on board, by the conductor. It really is an education campaign. Everyone really is in this. And on top of that, obviously it's that physical sentiment, the conductor wearing the mask, conductor wearing their gloves. We're actually now putting hand sanitizer units directly on the train cars. And we're continually looking at experimenting with some newer technology out there, and we're messaging that every way we can to make sure people understand they're entering a safe environment, the employees are working in a safe environment.
Rocky Donahue, is there social distancing right now on buses, or are passengers able to sit in every available seat?
No, on PACE buses, there's definitely social distancing. We're trying to limit our capacity to 15 riders maximum. We've blocked off seats. We've put extra buses out to handle when there are more than 15 passengers. And really, as you mentioned earlier, I want to thank our frontline employees. These guys are really heroes. They're going to work every day so other heroes can get to their job, be it workers at the grocery store, workers at the hospitals or medical facilities. And these heroes are not only the operators, they're the maintenance guys, they're the mechanics, and they're truly, like I said, heroes moving heroes.
Dorval Carter, I'll pose a question to you that I posed earlier in the show to Jim Derwinski at Metra. What are you thinking about the long-term prospects for ridership on the CTA, 1 year out, 2 years out, 5 years out, if this becomes a trend and people stay home instead of commute to work?
I tend to view the same way Jim does, is that public transportation is always going to be a critical component in a major urban environment like Chicago. People are not going to be able to drive their way out of congestion and the other impacts that occur with that. And, I believe that ridership is going to come back eventually. It's going to take a while. I don't think we're going to see any significant growth in ridership until there's a vaccine, and that vaccine has been applied throughout the city or throughout the country. But I think as a practical matter, in order for the economy to get rolling again, in order for the city to recover from this entire impact of this pandemic, public transportation has to be a significant part of that effort.
Leanne Redden, how about you? Is there a system-wide planning that has to take place for a future that may look different than the past?
Well, I think one of the things that we're undertaking right now is what we're kind of calling scenario planning. And it's not predicting the future, but it's looking at a range of different options, from everything from sort of a depression through a full recovery of the economy, but trying to help us plan out what those scenarios might look like so that the three operators can then look at that through sort of a fiscal lens and an operating lens and make determinations of what that future might be.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. And my thanks again to Leanne Redden, Rocky Donahue, Dorval Carter Jr., and Jim Derwinski. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, Jeffrey Bayer gives us a history lesson on the humble origins of trendy tiny houses in this week's Ask Jeffrey. But first, we take a look at the weather.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
Whether you call them coach houses, carriage houses, or granny flats, these small living spaces have loomed large in recent news here. Jeffrey Bayer says, put them in, coach, in tonight's edition of Ask Jeffrey. Jeffrey, how's it going?
It's going great, Paris.
All right, I feel like we cover this every week. This is such a hot topic in Chicago right now. So we got a letter from Ellen Palmer in Rogers Park. She says, tiny houses are a big trend now, but there are a few old ones in my Rogers Park neighborhood that I'm eager to know about. What do they look like inside? They are wonderful little gems. So what do they look like inside?
Well, we're going to see. But it's important to note that the tiny houses that our viewer is admiring are not the tiny houses of the environmental movement over the last decade or so, encouraging people to build houses with small footprints. These are actually coach houses, also called carriage houses or rear houses, which have a much older pedigree. Coach houses are remnants of the time, of course, when Chicago, like all cities, was dependent on horses for personal transportation. So the coach house was where the horses and carriages were kept, and sometimes even included living quarters for the coachmen and for the groomers. The owners of this Andersonville home say that the coach house, which they offer as a vacation rental, had 2 living spaces above what were the stables. They also said that when they moved in, there was an old bell inside the main house that you could pull, and it would ring in the coach house and signal for the coach to be brought around for the trip.
Wow, that feels very Downton Abbey. Jeffrey, so basically what you're saying is they're a garage for horses.
Exactly. But cars don't need quite as much room as horses and carriages, so once the automobile entered the scene, some coach houses were repurposed as garages for those newfangled automobiles. Others as an additional standalone living space, formally known in zoning law as accessory dwelling units, or ADUs.
Yes, it's important to get that zoning language correct. All right, so does this mean that all the coach houses in Chicago were at one point used for this purposes, for horses?
No, not all of them. Some were built after the horse era to function as additional living space, and some of those were probably built illegally because in 1957, Chicago's City Council made sweeping changes to zoning ordinances that included, among other things, a ban on building new coach houses as living spaces. At the time, city planners were concerned about overcrowding. Coach houses already in existence in 1957 were grandfathered in, but there was a catch. Once a unit went unoccupied for a year, it could not be used as a living space anymore.
I alluded to this at the beginning. The reason this discussion is in vogue right now is because they've been suggested as a way to increase affordable housing in Chicago.
Yeah, exactly. The idea of lifting the ban on building new ADUs in the city has gained momentum actually in the last couple of years. Ending the ban would also allow these coach houses, the ones that were disqualified as living spaces since 1957, to return to the rental market. And as you point out, a vote was proposed on a measure to lift the ban. It was scheduled for July 21st. But it was canceled due to opposition citing concerns about density changing the character of neighborhoods.
Right, so it appears that it's been stalled out for now, haha. Are there more coach houses in some neighborhoods than in other neighborhoods?
Absolutely, and our viewer did spot a lot of coach houses in her neighborhood, Rogers Park, but according to an analysis by urban planner Stephen Vance for Chicago Cityscape, Rogers Park doesn't even crack the top 10 Chicago neighborhoods for coach houses. Here's a heat map that Vance made of the 2,400 coach houses in Chicago. Lots of them are in Westtown, South Lawndale, and Lincoln Park, as well as Lakeview and Logan Square. And in some historic Chicago neighborhoods, there are some coach houses that rival the main house in beauty. Take a look at this. The 1886 Ransom Cable House, designed by Henry Ives Cobb, just off Magnificent Mile, today is the home of Driehaus Capital Management. That's the investment management firm founded by the famous investor and philanthropist Richard H. Driehaus. Now, the coach house is made of the same peachy pink Casota stone as the main house, quite fancy. In the Douglas neighborhood, in the 1885 Wood Maxey Boyd House, belonged for many years to prominent sociologist Dr. Alva Maxey Boyd, and at 3,000 square feet, this coach house is hardly a tiny house. Maxey Boyd died in 2009, and the coach house has since been restored to its former glory, along with the main house.
All right, Jeffrey, I have to admit there's one coach house in the city that I am particularly fond of. That is the Ponce Studio.
Oh, yes, of course. Familiar name there. Chicago artist Anne Ponce, might recognize that last name, works out of a coach house turned art studio on the north side. Before it was Anne's Studio. Her husband, Phil Ponce, maybe you've heard of him, tells us that this is where the former Clark Dairy kept their horses and milk delivery wagons.
Anne's husband, Phil. I do think I've heard of him. That's quite an amazing house. All right, thank you very much, Jeffrey.
My pleasure.
And don't forget that you can trot on over to our website for more details about this and other Ask Jeffrey stories. And while you're there, don't forget to submit your own question to Jeffrey Bayer. That's all at WTTW.com/news. And up next, we check back in with Amanda Vinicky for our weekly Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series, so please stick around.
Ask Jeffrey is made possible in part by BMO Harris Bank.
Wow, you ready?
Yeah, let me just grab my wallet.
Uh-oh, I've seen this before. Wallet way too big, skinny jeans too skinny.
I'll just carry it.
Before you break something, you should know you don't actually need a wallet. With BMO Harris, you can just take cash out with your phone. Or if you need to, you can pay them with Zelle. That works? Yeah. You're stuck, aren't you?
Smile.
Woo! Those jeans are way too tight.
That feeling you get when no wallet is no big deal. That's the BMO effect.
Time to go back to Amanda Vinicky, who's co-anchoring tonight's show in the city's West Ridge community as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. Amanda.
I'm currently joined by Angie Lobo. She is the director of the Indo-American Center, which provides immigration counseling and other services to, well, the Indo-American population here. Welcome back. Chicago Tonight last spoke with you in March. What has changed since then?
A lot of things have changed. Some things have improved for the better. We've been able to deliver culturally appropriate meals to seniors, which was a big effort undertaking to make sure that seniors who were homebound had food that they were familiar with.
And by culturally appropriate, you mean?
Indian food that, you know, that the normal population that would normally come to the center to receive lunch daily and then we're stuck and homebound could then still receive those same meals and those same groceries. So that is a big improvement. And we've also been doing a ton of work around language access and translating public health documents, state benefits documents, as many documents as we can get our hands on in time that we have to translate, and we really think that that's helped with a lot of the community education.
And attribute part of that to why there has been such a decline in COVID-19 cases in the area.
We would love to think that, yes, our public education efforts in the proper languages really helped.
Now, you also provide immigration counseling and services. What is the greatest challenge there?
Well, if you're paying attention to the news, you know that the immigrant community is under attack right now. At the federal level, there are new rulings coming every day about who can come in the country, who cannot, when they can come, when they can't. Some of our biggest challenges are you know, people who had work visas or student visas and lost their jobs, or they're worried about maybe their school is online. If you remember, there was a big story about
you have to go home, not able to continue if your school was going to go only online.
Exactly.
So is that where you've dedicated a lot of emergency cash assistance, or what is the need for that?
Yeah, so the need for emergency cash, unfortunately and sadly, is growing and growing and growing, because as this drags on longer and longer, it's harder and harder for people to make ends meet. You know, people can scrimp along for a little while, but as it gets longer, it gets more difficult. So our emergency cash assistance has really been focused on folks that, you know, lost their jobs, need help with rental assistance, food assistance, medical assistance, really anything. And the niche that we've been working on there is that there are a lot of programs for different funds for folks that are undocumented, which of course we're also very involved in, as Indian-American communication is the second highest undocumented population in Chicago. So we've been working really hard on that. But then there's also this little group of people that's falling through the cracks, which is people that have work visas or student visas who are not getting the federal stimulus money because they're technically not residents. And the state funds that are focused on folks who are undocumented, they're not eligible because technically they're not residents. So they're not eligible. So at Indo-American Center, we've really been focusing on that community and making sure that folks who have lost their jobs, or maybe their visa is expired, but they don't have anywhere to go, that we're really helping make sure to get the cash assistance out to that community.
A continuing issue, of course, is the pandemic continues to linger, and I know we've got to wrap up here, but you're also doing a whole lot of census outreach.
Yes.
Work everywhere. So thank you so much to Angie Lobo. Again, she is with the Indo-American Center. Paris, back to you in the studio.
All right, it's good to see Angie Lobo again. We visited her about 4 months ago. And the pandemic is forcing Special Olympics Illinois to conduct their annual Duck Derby a little bit differently this year, but there is one tradition that remains the same. Arts correspondent Angel Ito shares more on their public duck display.
Rubber ducks are taking over downtown Chicago in an annual art display. Ducks on the Mag Mile is celebrating 15 years with Special Olympics Illinois. It's their annual Duck Derby fundraiser, where adopted rubber ducks are poured into the Chicago River. This year's fundraiser consisted of a virtual festival where people were still encouraged to adopt a duck for $5 and participate in all of the activities. Chris Winston with Special Olympics Illinois says the public has responded well to the virtual switch.
They know that's still happening. They know they can still win prizes. They know they can adopt them safely. So I think because of that, we had kind of an aha moment. Certainly don't want a pandemic to keep going, of course, but doing this virtually and getting people to buy the way they did really worked.
And while the Duck Derby may be over, there's still time to see them on display in the Magnificent Mile. They'll also be on display in Streeterville, River North, and the Gold Coast. The 25 duck sculptures were designed by Chicagoland artists, some who also have disabilities.
You put some glitter down here. What were some of the other details?
It's very important to me that it has to be classy, elegant, and very glamour.
For Sean Smith, it was a great opportunity for him to create his cartoon-style images.
It's those differences that should be celebrated, And a lot of my work is already involved in that, particularly with the shape work, because there are all different shapes and sizes and colors.
And while Smith uses bright colored shapes to accentuate his duck, artist Roy Adorjan uses spray paint.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun creating this piece because obviously you've got the Chicago Bulls notables that you see there. And I thought it was a lot of fun to kind of tie it in together with the ribbon there, that not only are they great athletes, but you can have other great athletes like the Special Olympic athletes.
Now, this art display may be annual, but this year the takeaway is much greater.
Instant gratification, and everybody who's seeing them is happy, and it's giving people a lot of joy.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
Again, these ducks are on display on the Mag Mile in Streeterville, River North, and the Gold Coast until September 27th. One note before we go, tonight is the final show on our longtime Chicago Tonight set. Take one last look. Chicago Tonight began here about 18 years ago and will be moving to some temporary digs across the hall as this studio undergoes a major renovation over the next few months. And that is our show for this Thursday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing, and you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also watch the show, podcast, and the PBS video app. Make sure to join us tomorrow at 7 for Week in Review.
All right, now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Amanda Vinicky. Thanks so much for watching. Stay healthy, stay safe, and good night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.